Hi, everyone. Today we start off in New Mexico, where a listener has an encounter in the middle of the desert that leaves him wondering what just happened. And then we head off to Assateague Island, where two girls hoping to see the wild ponies experience something very different. And finally, we end up in Lincoln, Nebraska, where something not right materializes right down the road. So cozy in, turn up the volume, click that button. Let's get into the stories. I'm sending this in anonymously. You'll understand why after hearing the story. Earlier this year, I moved to New Mexico. I'm originally from Philadelphia, and moving out west was a huge culture shock. Between the sheer emptiness of the place and the long drives, I almost felt like I was in another country. I had moved in with my aunt, who lived alone. She was getting older and was finding it hard to take care of herself after my uncle passed. And since I didn't really have much going on back home, I volunteered to go out to stay with her for a while and just help with things around the house. I worked remotely anyway. I love my aunt, and the little town she lives in is beautiful, and the locals are all extremely nice. Nothing like back home. But it was boring for me because I didn't know anybody. I mean, how much Netflix can you possibly watch? So, looking for something to do, I did the logical thing, and I made a Tinder profile. I matched with a few different girls, and some of them were nice enough, but they all lived pretty far away. Eventually, I met this cute girl named Emily, and we really started hitting it off. But she lived 90 minutes away in Santa Fe, which by New Mexico standards was right down the road. A few days later, I ended up driving out to meet her for a date, and we had a great time. We both wanted to see each other again, so I made plans to come back the following Friday. Little did I know that Friday night would be the most terrifying night of my life. The roads out west are dark, and I don't mean dim or kind of hard to see. I mean pitch black, can't see jack, dark. I was sort of getting used to it, but it still kind of bugged me out. Anyway, Emily had to work until 8 p.m., so I planned to pick her up from the house at 10 o'clock at night. Yeah, I was kind of banking on her letting me stay over since I didn't want to drive home at 3 a.m. So I'd been driving for about 45 minutes, and I had only passed 2 other cars on the road, and the last one had been 20 minutes prior. So then I was fiddling with the radio trying to find a station, and I subconsciously slowed the car down quite a bit. And that's what probably saved the guy's life, at least initially. I just happened to glance up, and at the last second, I saw somebody frantically waving their arms in the middle of the road, right in front of my car. I slammed on my brakes, but it was too late, and I simultaneously felt and heard the impact. Luckily, they were off to the side a bit, but the person was still hurled back about 10 feet away, and my car made this horrific screeching noise as I came to a stop. Now, my Jeep is pretty old and didn't have airbags, but luckily my seatbelt stopped me from slamming my head on the wheel. After a second, I came to the realization that I had just hit somebody. I was shaking so badly that it took me a few seconds to unclip my seatbelt, but when I did, I opened the car and I ran outside to the body laying in the road. It was a young guy, probably early 20s or so. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his jeans were all torn up, and he was missing a shoe. As far as I could tell, he was unconscious, but breathing. I ran back to the car to get my cell phone, but of course you don't get service here because I was literally in the desert. I wasn't sure what to do at this point, so I just went back to the guy and crouched down next to him. I got a good look at him at this point and realized he was very unhealthy looking, emaciated, and sort of sick looking. I sat there for another minute or so weighing my options, which is when I heard something coming out of the darkness on the side of the road. It sounded like a growl that a house dog would make, only it was throatier, almost like a choking or gargling sound. I don't have the words to really explain it, but it wasn't a noise I had ever heard any living creature make. Trying to convince myself it was a coyote or something, I grabbed the guy under the armpits and I started dragging him back to my Jeep. I was going to put him in the passenger seat and just drive to the hospital in Santa Fe or flag somebody down for help if I got the chance. When I got to the passenger side of the car, I realized the door was locked. Luckily, I was driving with my window down, so I laid the guy down gently and I walked around to the other side and unlocked the door. I walked to the trunk of my Jeep thinking maybe I had some clothes or something to cover him up with. At least I could try to make him comfortable. But not finding anything useful, I closed the trunk and I walked back to the passenger side. The guy was now sitting up. His shoulders were pumping up and down rapidly, though, almost like he was hyperventilating. I was behind him, but it seemed like he was staring at something straight ahead, right where the headlights were pointing. I looked up. This thing was standing in the dead center of the road. It was on all fours, but its hind legs were twice as long as its front, giving it this weird sloping angle. It had this row of needle-thin quills running up its spine, each about a foot long, it seemed like. It was salivating something vicious and black. Steam was rising from the pavement where it dripped in thick clumps. Even hunched down the way it was, it still had to be taller than my 6'1". The three of us were completely still at this point, almost like we were waiting for the other to act. The guy decided it would be him. He let out a scream that seemed like it filled the entire desert. I don't know how he did it, but 1 second he was sitting down, and the next he was sprinting off down the road into the darkness. The creature opened its mouth impossibly wide, and then it let out its own scream, perfectly mimicking the tone and pitch that the guy had just made. I bolted for the back of the Jeep. I felt something hard slam into the hood, and I just stood crouched in the silence. I waited a few minutes, the whole time hearing the guy screaming repeatedly, but getting farther and farther away. I couldn't see the guy or the creature. My heart was pounding, and I was trying not to throw up. After a few minutes, I stood up, looked through the rear-view windshield, and I didn't see anything. So I crept up along the side of my car, got to the door, and quietly opened it. And that's when I heard the same scream again, this time right behind me. One hand on the door, I pulled it open, jumped in the car, and shut it behind me. Something hard hit the side of my Jeep, and for a split second, I thought it was going to tip. I never turned the car off, luckily, so I just reached down and pushed down on the gas. Of course, the car was in park, the engine just strained like it was about to burst. So I reached up with my hand, shifted into drive, and the car leapt forward. I drove about 50 feet, shifted myself so that I was sitting properly, and then kept on driving. I left the guy out there in the desert, alone with that thing. I'm ashamed. I can't be certain, but there's a good chance that the guy is dead, and I'm partly, if not totally, to blame. I never went to see Emily that night. I drove till I hit an intersection and just ended up taking the long way back to my aunt's. I know that I'm a horrible person. Now, this is partly a confession and partly a warning. A warning that there is something unnatural living and hunting out in the desert of New Mexico. In the mid-2000s, I was attending college at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Growing up in Iowa, I had always wanted to find a way to be closer to the ocean. So I loved the location, and I figured I'd get plenty of time to explore. But then I always felt so overwhelmed with studying and assignments, and it ended up that I seemed to spend most of my time inside. Anyway, my roommate Amanda and I decided to abandon our schoolwork one weekend and finally go have an adventure. We decided to go to Assateague Island. It's a barrier island and a refuge for a lot of different wildlife. I was most excited to check out the feral ponies that I had heard about. There don't really seem to be many places where you can see wild horses anymore. So we decided to camp even though it was the off-season and would be pretty chilly. At least there were no crowds. So we borrowed a bunch of gear from our hardcore camping friend and we headed out. We stopped at the visitor center and the rangers told us where we would be likely to see the horses. They told us to just make sure we put away all of our food items whenever we were away from the campsite. We showed them the bear-proof cooler we had borrowed, and they said that was fine. We set up our camping spot, and we went to the recommended trail. And when we were out there, we caught sight of horses off in the distance. They had told us to stay at least 40 feet away from them, but we were able to get a good look. We were happy to get a not-too-distant view of horses across an inlet, but then we were really excited when the herd stormed through the water and toward the area where we were standing. There must have been 3 different herds while we were hiking around that morning. We had some binoculars so we could spot them in the distance, and then we were satisfied with our sightings by noon. We took the rest of the day to have a cookout and just relax on the beach. I was ready for bed early, and I got in my sleeping bag right after sunset with my book. I must have fallen asleep right away, and the next thing that I knew, I was woken by something howling. Now, I'm familiar with coyotes and wolves, but this did not sound like that. It was higher. and screechier, and it gave me goosebumps all over. And I could have sworn it was getting closer. I convinced myself it must be one of the island foxes, so I just fell asleep again, but then this horrible growling woke me up again. It was a really low growl and guttural and rumbling. I could hear something rustling outside the tent, and it was probably half an hour before the noises stopped and I could sleep again. The next day, we decided to take the wildlife loop trail. It was maybe 3 miles long, and it gave good views of the marsh and the forest. We ended up staying out there a long time, exploring. And by the time we decided to head back to camp, we were both pretty tired and it was almost sunset again. We came over the crest of a dune and could see our tent a ways away. It looked like it was fluttering in the wind, more than it should be. I could tell there was some stuff on the ground by the tent, and I remember saying how weird that was. And then as we got closer, we could see that the tent door was hanging unzipped and flapping around. The stuff on the ground was a bunch of our stuff, our sleeping bags, and clothes. I mean, what the heck? We were thinking somebody had robbed us. We knew we hadn't left any food unsecured, and it didn't seem like the work of an animal because the zippers were just pulled down like a person would do. Inside the tent, there were big, muddy prints all over the floor. If I didn't know better, I would have thought they were from a giant dog. Our bags had been opened and all of the contents had been removed and thrown around. All the food that had been securely locked inside the cooler was gone, and everything was covered with sand and mud. We were totally mystified. And then I heard that growl that I had heard in the night before. I was instantly petrified. I can't tell you how primal it sounded. Amanda and I rushed out and we heard it coming towards us then from the trees. We both screamed when we saw this huge werewolf-looking creature. It was obviously eating something, and it looked like a 6 or 7 foot tall wolf, but it had the torso of a man. It had a long snout and sharp fangs, and when it howled, it sounded a lot like a human scream. It was facing sideways to us, so I couldn't really see its eyes, but its back was kind of hunched and it had massive shoulders. It never looked toward us. It seemed to finish what it was eating and then turned away and went into the trees. We were literally shaken from the shock of seeing that thing. We knew we had to leave. We pulled everything out of the tent and shook it off as best as we could, and we threw everything in the trunk. We raced out of there, and we did stop at the ranger station, but it was after hours, and we couldn't see anybody around. We didn't know what to do. We ended up just going home and called them the next day to describe what we had seen. I have no idea if they took us seriously, or if they thought we were just seeing things. In any case, if any of your listeners have any idea what the heck was going on there, please write in and let us know. It really messed up our heads, and it started out as a great trip. I've lived on the same block all my life, just outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. My family and I were always super welcoming to new neighbors, and we've had many families move away and new ones move in over the years. However, the house at the end of our block had sat empty for a few months until one day I saw a young man doing things around the yard in the evening. I'd usually take our dog for a walk around the block, and I figured I'd make my way over to say hello. I strolled over and I let out a neighborly hey. He perked up his head and greeted me and my dog. I conversed with him for a bit and came to find out his name was Brian, and he was only 22. I thought it was odd for a homeowner to live alone at that age. Given that he was only 22, though, he had extremely good manners and appeared to be a well-put-together gentleman. He told me he had just come back from serving overseas, and then he went on about how he got injured in the field of duty, so his time was cut short and he was sent home. I congratulated him on his return and I waved goodbye for the night. The next day was Saturday, and so I thought to myself, why don't I bake some cookies and take them over? When morning came, I did just that and then headed to his house around noon. I knocked a few times, but there was no answer at the door. Not thinking much of it, I figured I would catch him later on in the day when I took the dog for a walk again. Throughout the day, I did work around the house a bit, played around in the garden, and eventually nighttime rolled around like clockwork. So that's when I took the dog for a walk, promptly at 6. The sun was disappearing behind the clouds and dusk was settling in. As I approached, it was almost like he knew I was coming, because I saw the light turn on, and he stepped outside on his porch and waved me over. I smiled and greeted to him as I got closer. I told him I had come by earlier, but I must have missed him. He didn't acknowledge it, but instead he just petted my dog and went on to tell me that he had a dog abroad that looked similar to mine. He seemed at ease, and we kept talking for a while on the porch. I asked him what it was like abroad, and he let out a small sigh. Feeling I had overstepped, I apologized, and I tried to change the subject. But he continued, and he said, "It was traumatizing. You see things you should never see." I sensed him growing emotional the more he told me. He continued on, saying he had lost one of his childhood friends and that had been the hardest. We'd grown up together and enlisted together when we turned of age, he said. He continued telling me that it was the summer of 41, and even though he continued talking, my brain was stuck on him saying 41. Was it possible he had a brain fart and meant 22? Not wanting to be rude, I let him continue on talking. By the time my brain focused on what he was now saying, I was starting to piece together some stuff. He mentioned war bonds and told me he worked alongside a juice jerker. My grandfather had served in World War II, and I remember he had used that term before too, but I never knew what it meant. By the time we wrapped up talking, I had so many questions, but none I could openly ask him, comfortably anyway. I thanked him for the visits and made my way home for the night. Immediately I went to my laptop, and I began looking up the term juice jerker. I came to find out that it was a term to describe electricians back in the day. Things started to click. I wanted to know more, and I couldn't wait until the following morning. I'd studied more about the war that night and learned more about it than I ever did in school. I even dug through our family photos in search of a picture of my grandfather when he served. Maybe I wasn't thinking straight, but I was starting to believe that whoever he was may have been from that time period. I mean, the math didn't add up, of course, but his dialect and knowledge about the war was on point. The next day came. I had a few errands to run. I was in a hurry all that day, and by the time I got home, it was around 4 o'clock. So I figured I'd clean up and maybe head over again when the night fell. I would have done just that, too. But when I glanced down the street at one point, I saw somebody hammering a for sale sign in the yard. I approached the lady, trying to help her, saying, "I think you have the wrong house." She frowned and glanced at her clipboard and said, "No, this is the right one." But I pressed on. "No, I'm sure I met the man who bought this house a few days ago." She paused and looked at me as if I was crazy. She went on to tell me that the home hadn't been purchased. She said somebody seemed to have taken down the original for sale sign, but assured me that it was still for sale. And then she got into her car and drove off. I glanced at the home in shock and went knocking on the door, still believing that there was some misunderstanding. For nearly 10 minutes I stayed knocking and looking through the windows. There was no sign of him anywhere. As the days went on, I never saw him again. I was puzzled, but most of all sad that I never got to know more about him or what happened to him. My dad then caught me sulking over a picture of my grandfather with a few of his friends while in the army. I hadn't looked at the picture too much before, but I noticed one of the men looked just like the man I met at the house, just like Brian. I found myself sitting there with my finger on the photo, pointing at him and thinking. And as my dad walked by, he said, "Oh yeah, that's Brian. He was a good friend of your grandpa." I was in shock, but it now all made sense. I didn't tell my dad right then, but I instantly knew that I had met my grandpa's childhood friend. Let me know what you think about these stories in the comments below. And don't forget to check out Donovan Dread, who releases almost every single day. Also, if you like true crime, then check out Donovan Dread True Crime. There are new releases several times a week.